Picture this. You're 13 years old, standing in the most magnificent palace in all of Europe, wearing a wedding dress that weighs more than you do. Golden threads catch the candlelight, pearls cascade down silk that cost more than entire villages see in a lifetime, and hundreds of the most powerful people in the world watch your every move. This should be the happiest day of your life, but your hands shake as you approach the altar. The man waiting for you is twice your age, a complete stranger who looks at you not with love, but with the cold calculation of someone who has just acquired valuable property. Your father, the most powerful man in Christendom, smiles from his papal throne as he watches his daughter become a political chess piece. Your new husband's family whispers among themselves, already planning how to use your marriage to secure political ties and secure territories. You are Lucrezia Borgia, and this moment will define not just your life, but how history remembers you for the next 500 years. But here's what history got wrong about Lucrezia Borgia. The stories you've heard, the accusations that turned her name into a synonym for evil, the tales of poison and incest and murder that have echoed through centuries, most of them are lies. Deliberate, calculated lies designed to destroy not just one young woman, but an entire family that dared to challenge the established order of Renaissance Italy. Before diving into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Renaissance intrigue. It's the story of how a child became a weapon, how xenophobia and political hatred can rewrite history, and how a young woman survived in a world designed to consume her. The real curse of Lucrezia Borgia wasn't the poison ring that probably never existed, or the incestuous affairs that certainly never happened. The real curse was being born a woman in a family that the entire world wanted to destroy. To understand Lucrezia's story, we must first understand the world that created her nightmare. Renaissance Italy wasn't the artistic paradise your art history textbooks described. It was a blood-soaked battlefield where city-states constantly warred against each other, where poisoning your enemies was considered routine diplomacy, and where the Catholic Church had become the most corrupt institution in Europe. Into this world in April 1480 was born a little girl who would become one of history's most misunderstood figures. Lucrezia Borgia entered the world in Rome, the illegitimate daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo de Borgia and his long-term mistress, Vanozza de Catane. But this wasn't just any cardinal. Rodrigo de Borgia was a man whose ambition burned so bright it could be seen from space, whose political cunning would make Machiavelli himself take notes, and whose family name would become synonymous with everything dark and twisted about Renaissance power politics. The Borgias were Spanish, and that detail is crucial to understanding everything that would follow. In Renaissance Italy, being Spanish made you an outsider, a foreigner, someone who didn't belong. The Romans called them Catalans with the same venom that others might use to say plague carriers. This wasn't casual prejudice, this was systematic xenophobia that would eventually be weaponized to destroy anyone who bore the Borgia name. Young Lucretia grew up in this atmosphere of barely contained hostility, but she also grew up with privileges that most children could never imagine. Unlike many illegitimate children of powerful men, Rodrigo acknowledged her as his daughter. This meant she received an education that was extraordinary for any child, let alone a girl in the 15th century. She learned to read and write in multiple languages: Latin, Spanish, Italian, French. She studied literature, music, and the arts. She was trained in the complex protocols of court life and the subtle arts of diplomacy. But there was a price for this education, a terrible understanding that came with growing up in the Borgia household. From her earliest memories, Lucrezia knew that she was not being educated for her own benefit. She was being prepared for her true purpose, to be married off to whoever could best advance her family's political ambitions. Every lesson, every skill, Every accomplishment was measured by how it would make her more valuable as a bride, more useful as a diplomatic tool. Picture a 10-year-old girl sitting in a sun-drenched Roman villa, carefully practicing her penmanship while her tutors discuss her future, as if she isn't in the room. They debate which families might be most advantageous to ally with, which young nobles might be suitable husbands, which regions could be most strategically important to control. Lucrezia listens to these conversations with the dawning horror of someone who realizes they are not a person, but a commodity. In 1492, when Lucrezia was 12 years old, her father achieved his ultimate ambition. Cardinal Rodrigo de Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, the most powerful man in the Christian world. The election was marked by rumors of bribery and corruption, so extensive that even by Renaissance standards it was shocking. But Rodrigo had won, and with the papal crown came the ability to reshape European politics through the strategic marriage of his children. For Lucretia, her father's elevation to the papacy was both triumph and catastrophe. On one hand, she was now the daughter of the Pope, which made her one of the most prestigious brides in all of Europe. On the other hand, it meant that every aspect of her life would now be scrutinized, analyzed, and ultimately sacrificed for political advantage. The first marriage negotiations began almost immediately. Lucrezia was still a child, barely 13, but in the brutal arithmetic of Renaissance politics, her youth was seen as an advantage. A young bride could be molded, controlled, and used for longer. She had more childbearing years ahead of her, more opportunities to produce the male heirs that would cement political alliances. The chosen husband was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a man 13 years older than his child bride. The Sforza family was one of the most powerful in northern Italy, controlling vast territories and commanding significant military forces. An alliance with them would give the Borgias crucial support in their efforts to expand papal power throughout the Italian peninsula. The marriage contract was negotiated with the same attention to detail that might be used for a major trade agreement. Lucretia's dowry was set at the astronomical sum of 31,000 ducats, more than $1 million in today's currency. Every aspect of the ceremony was planned to demonstrate Borgia power and wealth. The wedding would take place in the Vatican itself, with Pope Alexander VI personally officiating at his daughter's marriage. But there was one concession to Lucrezia's extreme youth. The marriage contract delayed consummation for a year, a practical measure to avoid the political consequences of a young bride facing medical risks far beyond her years. On June 12, 1493, Lucretia Borgia walked down the aisle of the Sistine Chapel to marry a man she had met only a handful of times. The ceremony was magnificent. Hundreds of candles illuminated frescoes by Michelangelo. Nobles from across Europe filled the chapel, and the air was thick with incense and the weight of political calculation. Contemporary accounts describe Lucrezia as radiantly beautiful, her long golden hair gleaming in the candlelight, her face serene despite the magnitude of what was happening to her. But if you looked closely at the wedding portraits, you might have noticed something in her eyes. A distance. A resignation that spoke to the terrible understanding that had shaped her young life. At 13, Lucretia Borgia was already learning the first and most important lesson of survival in her world. Your feelings, your desires, your very humanity were secondary to the political needs of your family. Giovanni Sforza, her new husband, was not a monster in the way that later propaganda would suggest. He was a typical Renaissance noble, ambitious, politically astute, and completely convinced that his wife existed primarily to serve his interests. Contemporary accounts suggest that he treated Lucretia with reasonable courtesy, certainly better than many wives of the era could expect. But courtesy is not the same as agency, and from the moment she arrived in Pesaro, Lucretia found herself trapped in a life that felt like a beautiful prison. The early months of marriage passed quietly enough. Lucrezia adapted to life in the Sforza court, learning the rhythms of her new home while carefully maintaining correspondence with her family in Rome. But beneath the surface of domestic tranquility, larger political forces were already beginning to shift in ways that would soon destroy her fragile peace. Pope Alexander VI was not content to simply hold the papal throne. He had grander ambitions to create a Borgia dynasty that would control not just the church, but vast territories throughout Italy. This required constant maneuvering, new alliances, fresh sources of military support. And that meant that Lucrezia's marriage, which had seemed so strategically important in 1493, was already beginning to outlive its usefulness. The problem was that the Sforza alliance wasn't providing the military support that the Borgias needed for their expanding ambitions. Giovanni Sforza controlled only a small territory, and his military resources were limited. Meanwhile, other Italian powers were offering much more attractive partnerships that would require the Borgias to be free of their current commitments. In the cold logic of Renaissance politics, this meant that Lucrezia's marriage had become an obstacle to be removed rather than an asset to be preserved. But ending a marriage was not a simple matter, especially when one party was the Pope's daughter. It would require careful legal maneuvering, political pressure, and ultimately, the complete destruction of Giovanni Sforza's reputation and dignity. The campaign against Giovanni began subtly, with whispered conversations in Roman palaces and carefully placed rumors about his loyalty and competence. Pope Alexander's agents began spreading stories that Giovanni was secretly negotiating with the Borgia's enemies, that he was planning to betray the papal alliance for his own advantage. None of these stories were true, but in the paranoid atmosphere of Renaissance Italian politics, truth was less important than plausibility. Giovanni, for his part, was not blind to what was happening. He could see the growing coolness in his communications with Rome, could sense the shifting political winds that threatened to leave him isolated and vulnerable. His response was to try to strengthen his position by demonstrating his value as an ally, but this only convinced the Borgias that he was becoming too independent, too difficult to control. By 1497, the decision had been made. Lucrezia's marriage to Giovanni Sforza would be annulled, clearing the way for a new alliance that would better serve Borgia ambitions. But annulment required specific legal grounds, and the most expedient option was to claim that the marriage had never been consummated due to Giovanni's impotence. This was not just a legal technicality, it was a calculated humiliation designed to destroy Giovanni's reputation and ensure his compliance. In Renaissance culture, accusations of impotence were devastating to a man's honor and political standing. It was a charge that would follow him for the rest of his life, marking him as weak, defective, unsuitable for the company of real men. When Giovanni received the papal demand for annulment, his fury was immediate and incandescent. He understood exactly what was being done to him and why. This wasn't about canon law or religious concerns, this was about political convenience and his own expendability in the Borgia game plan. His response would unleash consequences that would haunt Lucretia for the rest of her life and poison her reputation for centuries to come. Faced with a choice between accepting humiliation or fighting back, Giovanni Sforza chose war. If the Borgias wanted to destroy his reputation, he would return the favor with interest. If they wanted to claim that his marriage was invalid, he would explain exactly why. And his explanation would be so scandalous, so shocking, that it would overshadow every other aspect of the annulment proceedings. Giovanni launched a devastating counterattack by spreading salacious accusations designed to permanently tarnish the Borgia name, including the most scandalous claims targeting family ties at the highest levels of church authority. But Giovanni didn't stop there. He fueled scandalous claims that blurred the lines of familial propriety, casting Lucrezia and Cesare at the heart of court gossip, and painting the Borgia name as a symbol of unchecked power and moral decay. These accusations were specifically designed to be unforgettable, unforgivable, and impossible to completely disprove. The effect was immediate and devastating. Within weeks, Giovanni's accusations were being repeated in courts across Europe, whispered in churches, discussed in taverns, and recorded in diplomatic correspondence. The Borgia name, already controversial due to their Spanish origins and political ambitions, became synonymous with the most extreme forms of moral corruption. For 17-year-old Lucrezia, the impact was catastrophic. Overnight, she went from being a political asset to being a liability, from being a valuable bride to being a scandal that threatened to destroy any family foolish enough to associate with her. The girl who had never been allowed to make her own choices was now being blamed for choices she had never made, accused of crimes she had never committed, condemned for sins that existed only in her enemy's imagination. But this was only the beginning of Lucrezia Borgia's ordeal. The accusations Giovanni Sforza had made would follow her through two more marriages, countless political crises, and ultimately into the history books themselves. The curse of Lucrezia Borgia was not supernatural. It was something far more dangerous and far more human. The willingness of powerful men to destroy a young woman's life rather than admit their own failures. The annulment proceedings that followed were a masterclass in Renaissance legal theater, a carefully choreographed performance designed to achieve a predetermined outcome while maintaining the pretense of canonical propriety. Pope Alexander VI assembled a tribunal of carefully selected cardinals, men whose loyalty to the Borgia cause was absolute and whose understanding of the desired verdict was crystal clear. The proceedings began in March 1497, with Lucretia herself as the star witness in her own marital destruction. Picture this 17-year-old girl standing before a panel of elderly men in scarlet robes, being asked to testify about the most intimate details of her married life. The questions were humiliating, invasive, designed to extract admissions that would support the predetermined conclusion of non-consummation. Lucrezia answered with the composure that had been drilled into her since childhood, confirming that her marriage had indeed never been physically completed. But her testimony carried an undercurrent of something darker, the recognition that she was participating in her own systematic degradation, that every word she spoke was another link in the chain that bound her to her family's political ambitions. The tribunal's verdict was never in doubt. On December 20th, 1497, Giovanni Sforza's marriage to Lucrezia Borgia was declared null and void on the grounds of his alleged impotence and the marriage's non-consummation. The legal language was precise and clinical, but the human cost was immeasurable. Lucrezia was officially declared to have never been married at all, her 4 years as a wife erased from the historical record as if they had never existed. Giovanni Sforza's response to this legal obliteration was to double down on his accusations with even more vicious specificity. In letters to courts across Europe, he elaborated on his charges of papal incest, providing salacious details that were clearly fabricated but impossible to ignore. He described supposed late-night encounters and behavior that, if true, would imply moral collapse at the highest levels, going so far as to claim that the Vatican itself had become a symbol of spiritual corruption. These accusations were not random slander. They were carefully crafted to exploit the deepest anxieties of Renaissance Christian society. The idea of papal corruption was already widespread. Pope Alexander VI's election had been marked by obvious bribery, and his open acknowledgement of his illegitimate children had scandalized even a church accustomed to corruption. Giovanni's accusations took these existing concerns and pushed them to their logical extreme, suggesting that the Borgias had crossed every possible line of moral decency. The political impact was immediate and devastating. Courts that had once eagerly sought Borgia alliances suddenly found excuses to avoid papal correspondence. Diplomatic marriages that had been under negotiation were quietly abandoned. The Spanish origins of the Borgia family, always a source of xenophobic resentment, now became proof of their fundamental foreignness to Christian European values. For Lucretia, the consequences were even more personal and immediate. At 17, she found herself simultaneously one of the most famous and most unmarriageable women in Europe. Her name was whispered in every court, her reputation discussed in every diplomatic meeting, her alleged crimes catalogued in every piece of anti-Borgia propaganda that circulated throughout the continent. The psychological toll on such a young woman must have been enormous. Lucrezia had grown up understanding that her value lay in her ability to form advantageous marriages, And now that variability had been systematically destroyed by forces entirely beyond her control, she was trapped in the Vatican, surrounded by luxury but effectively imprisoned, watching as her father and brothers plotted to rebuild the political capital that Giovanni Sforza's accusations had destroyed. Pope Alexander VI's response to the crisis revealed both his political acumen and his complete willingness to sacrifice his daughter's personal happiness for strategic advantage. Rather than retreating from the marriage market, he decided to demonstrate the falseness of Giovanni's accusations by arranging an even more prestigious match for Lucrezia. If she was truly the corrupted woman that her first husband claimed, no respectable family would consider marrying into the Borgias. But if a major noble house was willing to accept her as a bride, it would implicitly refute the charges against her. The chosen husband was Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie and Prince of Salerno, the illegitimate son of Alfonso II of Naples. This was a significant step up from Giovanni Sforza in terms of political importance. The Kingdom of Naples was one of the major powers in Italian politics, and an alliance with the Aragonese royal house would provide the Borgias with the military support they desperately needed for their territorial ambitions. But there was something different about this marriage negotiation. Alfonso of Aragon was only 17 years old, just months older than Lucrezia herself. For the first time in her life, she would be marrying someone from her own generation, someone who might understand the pressures and compromises that shaped noble life in ways that Giovanni Sforza, 13 years her senior, never could. The wedding took place in July 1498, a more subdued affair than Lucrezia's first marriage, but still magnificent by any reasonable standard. This time, however, there were no delays for the bride's youth, no concessions to her physical or emotional readiness. The political situation was too urgent, the need to demonstrate her marriageability too pressing, to allow for such considerations. Contemporary accounts of the early months of this second marriage paint a picture that was remarkably different from the cold political arrangement that had characterized Lucrezia's relationship with Giovanni Sforza. Alfonso of Aragon was described as handsome, charming, and genuinely fond of his young wife. For perhaps the first time in her life, Lucretia experienced something approaching a normal marital relationship, one based on mutual affection rather than pure political calculation. Letters from this period reveal a young woman discovering aspects of herself that had been suppressed during her first marriage. Lucretia wrote to friends about her happiness, about the pleasure she took in her husband's company, about her hopes for the future. She began to believe that perhaps her life could be more than just a series of political transactions, that she might actually find personal fulfillment within the constraints of her dynastic obligations. This happiness, however, was built on foundations that were inherently unstable. The alliance with Naples that had prompted her marriage to Alfonso was part of a larger chess game involving France, Spain, and the various Italian city-states. As these larger political forces shifted, the value of any particular alliance could change overnight, transforming assets into liabilities and friends into enemies. The first signs of trouble came in late 1499, when Pope Alexander VI began negotiating with Louis XII of France for support in his territorial campaigns in the Romagna. The French king was willing to provide military assistance, but he demanded something in return. The Borgias would need to abandon their alliance with Naples and support French claims to the Neapolitan throne. This demand put Lucrezia's second marriage in immediate jeopardy. Alfonso of Aragon represented the alliance with Naples that the Borgias were now being asked to betray. As long as he remained married to the Pope's daughter, he was both a symbol of that alliance and a potential source of intelligence for Neapolitan forces opposing French expansion. Alfonso himself was acutely aware of the danger his position represented. By early 1500, he was receiving warnings from friends and allies that his continued presence in Rome was becoming untenable. The French alliance was moving forward, and his value as Lucrezia's husband was rapidly being outweighed by his liability as a representative of enemy interests. In August 1500, Alfonso made the decision to flee Rome, hoping to reach the safety of Naples before the political situation deteriorated further. But his flight was seen as confirmation of his disloyalty, proof that he had been planning to betray the Borgias all along. Pope Alexander VI issued orders for his immediate return, promising safe conduct but making it clear that refusal would be seen as an act of war. Alfonso returned to Rome in October, accompanied by Lucrezia, who had followed him to Naples and convinced him that her father's guarantees of safety could be trusted. It was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, because she had unknowingly helped lead her husband into a trap from which there would be no escape. The end came on July 15th, 1500, as Alfonso climbed the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He was attacked in public and later died under suspicious circumstances. Many believed it was an orchestrated political execution. Alfonso survived the initial attack, but he was grievously wounded, and his recovery would require weeks of careful nursing. Lucretia threw herself into caring for her injured husband with a devotion that surprised even those who knew her well. She prepared his food with her own hands, tasted every dish to ensure it contained no poison, and maintained a constant vigil by his bedside. For weeks it seemed as though her dedication might save him, that love and careful nursing might triumph over political necessity. But on August 18th, 1500, as Alfonso lay recovering in his bed at the Vatican, while recovering, he died under suspicious and politically charged circumstances. Many believed his death was no accident, but rather the result of calculated decisions made far from his bedside. The official explanation was that Alfonso had died from complications related to his wounds, but no one believed it. The truth was too obvious, the timing too convenient, the method too characteristic of Cesare Borgia's approach to problem-solving. Lucrezia's second husband had been murdered on the orders of her own brother in her father's palace, while under her personal care. The psychological impact on 19-year-old Lucretia was devastating. She had not only lost a husband she genuinely loved, but she had been made complicit in his death through her own efforts to save him. Every meal she had prepared, every moment of care she had provided, had simply prolonged his suffering while the real decision about his fate was being made in meetings she wasn't allowed to attend. The grief that followed Alfonso's murder was unlike anything Lucrezia had experienced before. This wasn't the abstract loss of political possibility that had marked the end of her first marriage. This was the violent destruction of personal happiness, the brutal reminder that in the Borgia world, even love was subordinate to power. Contemporary accounts describe her as inconsolable, spending days in prayer, refusing to eat, showing all the signs of someone whose faith in the possibility of personal happiness had been permanently shattered. But even in her grief, Lucretia was not allowed the luxury of extended mourning. The political wheels that had crushed her second marriage were already turning toward her third, and Pope Alexander VI was determined that his daughter's personal tragedy would not be allowed to interfere with larger strategic objectives. The French alliance that had cost Alfonso his life now required cementing through new marriages, new hostages to political fortune. The new prospective husband was Alfonso I d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, heir to one of the most prestigious courts in all of Italy. The Este family had ruled Ferrara for generations, transforming their city into a beacon of Renaissance culture where poets, artists, and scholars gathered under ducal patronage. An alliance with Ferrara would provide the Borgias with crucial military support while positioning them at the heart of northern Italian politics. But there was a problem that went far beyond the usual complexities of diplomatic marriage negotiations. The Este family was horrified by the prospect of accepting Lucrezia Borgia as a daughter-in-law. Giovanni Sforza's accusations had done their work too well, and the stories of papal incest and Borgia corruption had spread throughout every noble house in Europe. Duke Ercole d'Este initially refused even to consider the match, declaring that his family's honor could not survive association with such scandal. The negotiation process that followed revealed the brutal arithmetic of Renaissance politics in its starkest form. Pope Alexander VI was not merely requesting a marriage, he was demanding it, and his demands came backed by the full military and political power of the Papal States. The alternative to accepting Lucrezia as a bride was facing Cesare Borgia's armies, and by 1501, Cesare had demonstrated repeatedly that he was perfectly willing to destroy entire cities to achieve his objectives. Duke Ercole found himself caught between impossible choices. Accepting Lucrezia would stain his family's reputation and potentially expose them to the scandals that seemed to follow the Borgias wherever they went. But refusing the match would almost certainly result in military invasion, the destruction of his territories, and the end of his dynasty. The pressure was so intense that he eventually agreed to the marriage, but only after extracting concessions that revealed just how toxic Lucrezia's reputation had become. The dowry demanded by the Este family was unprecedented. 100,000 ducats in gold, along with extensive territorial concessions and military guarantees. This was more than 3 times what any previous Borgia bride had brought to her marriage, a financial burden so enormous that it strained even the papal treasury. The message was clear. If the Este family was going to accept the risk of associating with Lucrezia Borgia, they would be compensated accordingly. But money was only part of the equation. Duke Ercole also demanded extensive legal protections, written guarantees that Lucrezia would be allowed to maintain her own household, her own servants, her own religious practices. These provisions weren't just about comfort. They were about creating barriers between the Este family and whatever scandals might emerge from continued association with the Borgias. Most tellingly, the marriage contract included unprecedented clauses about potential annulment. If Lucrezia's reputation became so damaged that it threatened the Este family's political position, they would have legal grounds to dissolve the marriage and return her to Rome. No noble marriage in Renaissance Italy had ever included such provisions. But then again, no noble marriage had ever involved a bride whose name had become synonymous with corruption and scandal. For Lucretia herself, these negotiations were a daily reminder of how completely her reputation had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. Every clause in the marriage contract that protected her future husband's family was simultaneously an accusation against her character. Every financial demand made by the Este family was an implicit statement about the cost of associating with her name. The psychological toll of watching these negotiations unfold must have been enormous. At 20 years old, Lucrezia had already buried one husband and seen another murdered, had been accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable, and was now watching as her third marriage was structured around the assumption that she was fundamentally dangerous to be around. The young woman who had once been seen as one of Europe's most desirable brides was now treated like a plague carrier who might contaminate anyone foolish enough to get too close. The journey to Ferrara in early 1502 was staged as a magnificent procession designed to demonstrate papal power and Borgia wealth. Lucrezia traveled with an entourage of hundreds, her possessions filling dozens of wagons, her route lined with celebrations and ceremonies that proclaimed the importance of this new alliance. But beneath the surface pageantry, the procession resembled nothing so much as a military campaign with armed escorts and carefully planned stops that reflected the very real security concerns surrounding the Pope's daughter. Contemporary accounts of Lucrezia's arrival in Ferrara paint a complex picture of a young woman struggling to reinvent herself yet again. She was described as stunningly beautiful, with golden hair that caught the winter sunlight and an elegance of bearing that commanded attention wherever she went. But observers also noted something guarded in her manner, a careful control that suggested someone who had learned not to trust appearances or assume that current happiness would last. The Este court itself was a revelation for Lucrezia. Unlike the political intrigue and constant maneuvering that had characterized life in Rome, Ferrara operated according to different principles. Art and learning were valued for their own sake, not merely as tools of political advancement. Conversations could focus on poetry or philosophy without every participant calculating how their words might be used against them later. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Lucretia found herself in an environment where intellectual curiosity was encouraged rather than viewed with suspicion. Duke Alfonso proved to be a surprisingly suitable husband despite his initial reluctance to accept the marriage. He was cultured, intelligent, and sophisticated enough to understand that his wife's reputation was largely the product of political propaganda rather than personal failing. More importantly, he was secure enough in his own position to allow Lucrezia the space to develop her own interests and relationships within the court. The early months of the marriage revealed aspects of Lucrezia's personality that had been suppressed during her previous relationships. She threw herself into the cultural life of Ferrara with an enthusiasm that surprised even her new family. She commissioned works from leading artists, maintained correspondence with some of the most important writers of the Renaissance, and began to develop her own salon where intellectuals gathered to discuss the great questions of their age. But even as Lucretia began to find genuine happiness in Ferrara, the larger forces that had shaped her life continued to operate with remorseless logic. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI was aging rapidly, and his death would inevitably trigger a succession crisis that could destroy everything the Borgias had built. Cesare's territorial conquests were impressive but unstable, dependent entirely on papal support that might disappear overnight. The entire Borgia enterprise was built on foundations that were fundamentally temporary. The first serious crisis came in 1503 when Pope Alexander VI fell seriously ill during one of Rome's periodic plague outbreaks. For weeks, his life hung in the balance while European courts watched nervously, calculating how his death might affect their own political positions. Lucrezia, safely established in Ferrara, found herself in the strange position of hoping for her father's recovery, while simultaneously recognizing that his death might finally free her from the scandals that had defined her young life. When Pope Alexander VI finally died in August 1503, the impact on the Borgia family was immediate and catastrophic. Cesare, who had built his power entirely on papal patronage, found himself suddenly vulnerable to all the enemies he had made during his meteoric rise. The territories he had conquered began to slip away almost immediately, and the alliances he had forged through fear and intimidation crumbled as soon as it became clear that papal protection was no longer available. For Lucretia, her father's death represented both liberation and loss. On one hand, she was finally free from the political machinations that had controlled every aspect of her life since childhood. The new pope, Julius II, was a Borgia enemy who wanted nothing more than to erase every trace of the previous administration. This meant that Lucretia would no longer be seen as a papal asset to be deployed in diplomatic negotiations, no longer be valuable enough to be worth destroying for political advantage. But liberation came at a cost. Alexander VI, whatever his faults as a father and a pope, had genuinely loved his daughter and had used his immense power to protect her interests. His death left her dependent entirely on the goodwill of her husband's family, with no independent source of power or protection. She was now just another duchess in a minor Italian court, significant only to the extent that her husband chose to make her so. The adjustment to this new reality was surprisingly difficult for someone who had spent her entire life complaining about political manipulation. Lucretia discovered that being irrelevant was almost as challenging as being too important. The constant attention that had defined her youth, whether positive or negative, was replaced by a kind of benign neglect that left her struggling to define her own purpose and identity. It was during this period of adjustment that Lucretia began to develop the interests and relationships that would define the rest of her life. Free from the need to constantly calculate political advantage, she could finally pursue genuine friendships with people who valued her intelligence and personality rather than her family connections. She became a patron of poets and scholars not because it served Borgia interests, but because she genuinely loved literature and learning. The transformation was gradual but profound. The young woman who had been defined entirely by scandal and political utility began to emerge as an individual with her own tastes, preferences, and ambitions. She developed a reputation for kindness and generosity that stood in stark contrast to the vicious rumors that had once surrounded her name. Visitors to Ferrara began to write admiringly of the Duchess's grace, intelligence, and genuine warmth. But the ghosts of her past were not so easily banished. Giovanni Sforza's accusations had taken on a life of their own, spreading through European culture like a virus that infected every subsequent account of Borgia history. Writers and historians who had never met Lucrezia, who knew nothing of her actual character or behavior, repeated the old stories as established fact. The image of Lucrezia Borgia as a poisoner, seductress, and participant in papal incest became so embedded in popular consciousness that no amount of contrary evidence could dislodge it. This created a strange double existence for Lucretia in her Ferrara years. To those who knew her personally, her husband, her children, the courtiers and intellectuals who formed her daily circle, she was simply the Duchess, a woman of obvious intelligence and genuine goodness, who happened to have been born into unfortunate circumstances. But to the wider world, she remained the infamous Borgia daughter, a figure of dark fascination whose very name conjured images of Renaissance corruption and sexual scandal. The contrast between these two versions of herself created a psychological burden that Lucretia carried for the rest of her life. She knew that history would remember the propaganda version rather than the human reality, that her actual character and accomplishments would be overshadowed by the lies that had been told about her youth. Every act of kindness, every patronage of art and learning, every demonstration of maternal devotion would be interpreted through the lens of the scandals that had destroyed her reputation before she was old enough to defend herself. Perhaps most tragically, Lucretia understood that this distorted legacy would affect not just her own historical reputation, but the lives of her children as well. They would grow up bearing the Borgia name, forever associated with the crimes and corruptions that their mother had allegedly committed. No matter how respectable her life in Ferrara became, no matter how completely she transformed herself from political pawn to cultural patron, the curse of her family name would follow her descendants for generations. The irony was bitter and inescapable. Lucrezia Borgia, who had spent her entire youth being used by others for their political advantage, would spend her adult years being used by historians and writers as a symbol of everything dark and corrupt about Renaissance Italy. The real woman, intelligent, kind, devoted to her children and her adopted city, would be forgotten in favor of a fictional monster created by men who had never bothered to learn who she actually was. Yet in her final years, something extraordinary happened that reveals the true measure of Lucrezia Borgia's character. As she settled into life in Ferrara, free from the political machinations that had defined her youth, she began to demonstrate qualities that gave the lie to every vicious rumor that had ever been spread about her name. Lucretia threw herself into motherhood with a devotion that bordered on the obsessive. She bore multiple children to Alfonso d'Este, and with each birth she seemed to be trying to create the kind of loving, stable family environment that she herself had never known. Contemporary accounts describe her as an exceptionally hands-on mother, unusual for a woman of her social standing. She insisted on nursing her own children, spent hours reading to them, and personally oversaw every aspect of their education. But motherhood in the Renaissance was a dangerous occupation, and Lucretia's body bore the accumulated damage of repeated pregnancies and miscarriages. Each birth weakened her further, and court physicians began to express concern about her ability to survive another confinement. She had given birth to at least 4 children who survived to adulthood, but the cost to her own health was becoming increasingly apparent. The woman who had once been celebrated for her golden beauty began to show the ravages of her difficult life. Her hair, still lustrous, now required elaborate styling to hide its thinning. Her face, while still lovely, bore lines that spoke of sorrows no cosmetics could conceal. Her hands, once soft and white as befitted a papal princess, now showed the marks of someone who spent her days in active service to others rather than passive luxury. Yet, as her physical beauty faded, something else emerged that was far more remarkable. Lucrezia developed a reputation for genuine sanctity that had nothing to do with political calculation and everything to do with authentic spiritual growth. She began spending increasing amounts of time in prayer and charitable works, not as a public performance but as a private communion with the divine that seemed to provide her with the peace that had eluded her throughout her turbulent youth. The transformation was so complete that visitors to Ferrara struggled to reconcile the woman they met with the scandalous reputation that had preceded her. Pietro Bembo, one of the greatest poets of the Renaissance, maintained a correspondence with Lucrezia that reveals a woman of deep intelligence and genuine spiritual insight. Their letters, preserved in various archives, show none of the calculating manipulation that contemporary accounts had attributed to her character. Instead, they reveal someone struggling with profound questions about faith, mortality, and the meaning of a life that had been shaped by forces beyond her control. As Lucretia entered her 30s, her focus shifted increasingly toward charitable works and religious devotion. She established hospitals, funded scholarships for poor students, and personally attended to the needs of Ferrara's most vulnerable citizens. These weren't the grand gestures of political theater that had characterized her father's approach to public relations. Instead, they were quiet, consistent acts of service that reflected a genuine desire to use her position for good. The irony was heartbreaking. The woman who had been accused of every form of moral corruption was spending her final years in acts of Christian charity that would have been impressive in a canonized saint. She fed the hungry, clothed the naked, visited the sick, and comforted the dying with a consistency that spoke to the depths of her transformed character. Yet none of these acts of genuine virtue could compete with the scandalous stories that continued to circulate about her youth. In 1519, at the age of 39, Lucretia Borgia faced her final pregnancy with the knowledge that her weakened body might not survive another birth. Court physicians had advised against it, her husband had expressed concern, and she herself seemed to understand that she was taking an enormous risk. But the desire to provide Alfonso with another heir, combined perhaps with a fatalistic acceptance of whatever God might will, led her to proceed despite the dangers. The labor was difficult from the beginning. For days, Lucretia struggled to bring forth life while her own ebbed away. The irony was terrible. The woman who had been accused of being a poisoner was being slowly killed by her own body's attempts to create new life. Court physicians tried everything their limited knowledge could suggest, but Renaissance medicine had no answers for the complications that were claiming the Duchess of Ferrara. On June 24, 1519, 10 days after giving birth to a daughter who would not survive infancy, Lucretia Borgia died in her bed at the Este Palace. Her final hours were spent in prayer, surrounded by priests and the family that had come to genuinely love her. Contemporary accounts describe her death as peaceful, marked by the kind of spiritual serenity that suggested someone who had finally found the redemption that had eluded her throughout her troubled life. Alfonso d'Este's grief was immediate and profound. The man who had initially resisted marrying the infamous Borgia daughter now found himself devastated by her loss. His letters to various European courts speak of losing not just a wife but a beloved companion whose intelligence, kindness, and genuine goodness had enriched every aspect of his life. The political alliance that had begun their relationship had evolved into something approaching genuine love, a transformation that spoke to Lucretia's ability to inspire affection in those who knew her personally, regardless of what the wider world believed about her character. The funeral that followed was a testament to how completely Lucretia had transformed her reputation among those who actually knew her. The citizens of Ferrara mourned her death with a sincerity that had nothing to do with political obligation and everything to do with genuine loss. She had become not just their duchess, but their benefactor, someone whose daily presence had made their lives tangibly better through countless small acts of kindness and generosity. Yet, even as Ferrara mourned the loss of their beloved duchess, the rest of Europe continued to remember Lucrezia Borgia primarily as the scandalous daughter of a corrupt pope. The stories that Giovanni Sforza had fabricated in his anger, the propaganda that political enemies had spread to damage the Borgia name, the sensational accounts that writers had embellished for their own purposes. All of these proved more durable than the truth of who she had actually been. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of Lucrezia Borgia's story. The woman who died in 1519 bore almost no resemblance to the monster of popular imagination, but the monster proved far more interesting to subsequent generations than the reality of a complex human being who had struggled to find meaning and purpose in a life shaped by forces beyond her control. The curse that had begun with her birth into the Borgia family continued long after her death, ensuring that her reputation would be forever tainted by crimes she had never committed and sins she had never embraced. Today, more than 500 years after her death, historians have largely rehabilitated Lucrezia Borgia's reputation. Modern scholarship has demonstrated conclusively that the accusations of moral depravity, violence, and institutional corruption that followed her throughout her life were politically motivated fabrications rather than historical facts. We now understand that she was more victim than perpetrator, more pawn than player in the brutal game of Renaissance Italian politics. But this scholarly rehabilitation has come too late to matter for the woman herself. Lucretia Borgia lived her entire adult life knowing that history would remember the lies rather than the truth, that her children would inherit not just her blood, but also the stain of accusations that had been created by men who cared nothing for her humanity. She died understanding that her legacy would be shaped not by her acts of charity, her devotion to her family, or her genuine spiritual growth, but by the political necessities that had required her destruction. The true curse of Lucrezia Borgia was not supernatural, but profoundly human. It was the curse of being born a woman in a world where women existed primarily to serve male ambitions, of being born into a family that made enemies faster than friends, of living in an age where reputation could be destroyed by whispered accusations and rebuilt only through centuries of patient scholarship that would come too late to matter to the person whose life had been damaged. Her story reminds us that behind every historical scandal, every legendary figure of supposed evil, there is often a human being whose actual life bore little resemblance to the myth that consumed their memory. Lucrezia Borgia deserved better than the reputation history gave her, but she also transcended it through the quiet dignity with which she lived her final years, and the genuine love she inspired in those who knew her as she actually was rather than as her enemies had painted her. In the end, perhaps that is enough. The lies told about Lucrezia Borgia may have echoed through 5 centuries, but the truth about her character, revealed in the tears of her husband, the grief of her adopted city, and the testimony of those who knew her personally, suggests that she succeeded in becoming the kind of person she chose to be rather than the monster others had demanded she become. That transformation, quiet and unrecorded by the history books that preferred sensation to truth, may be the most remarkable achievement of a life that began in scandal but ended in something approaching grace.